This is fun. This is a very new experience for me and maybe for you as well, to be sitting alone on the stage and to be interviewing a disembodied voice. But just testing it out. Can you hear me, Kay?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Brilliant. That's awesome. OK, cool. So to start things off, I just thought I'd quickly introduce myself, and then I'll let Kay introduce himself. But I'm Magnus. I'm working with byFounders. So byFounders is an early-stage community-driven fund investing in the new Nordics. And we are very proud investors in Kay and ICO. And before I jump into Kay, I just also want to give an overview of the insane progress we've had in the last few years, right? I think when I first understood how cool AI was going to be was when I saw GPT-1 get released the first time. A massive model that was trained for the first time at that scale, right? And at the time, I remember that they were basically expecting it to be some kind of smart autocorrect, to be able to spit out tokens with slightly better accuracy than the autocorrects we had in the past. But it turned out that it could actually start understanding fairly good grammar and figure out the best word that was going to come afterwards, but also the word after that a lot of the time, and start writing sentences that kind of made sense. And then GPT-2 came out, and it could start writing entire paragraphs that could reference earlier sentences and understand information. It could answer questions like who the President of the United States is, that kind of stuff. It could memorize knowledge, which is not what was expected at all, right? This was like completely a complete surprise to even the researchers that were training these models at the time. Then we had GPT-3, which was really like a lightning strike moment. I think when GPT 3.5 and then obviously ChatGPT was launched was when I think most of the world woke up to what was going on here. These models were not only able to do smart autocorrect, they could also start actually having some type of early hints of kind of general intelligence, right? Not at the human level, but at a similar type of flavor to the type of intelligence that we have. Now we are a few years along, and we have had GPT-4 and most recently GPT 4.0. And the cutting edge right now is to use these models in an agentic type way. So you use these LLMs to basically output text, and then you use that text to perform actions of various kinds. In the internet, everything that we do is text, right? We're sending back and forwards HTML pages. That boils down to text. So every action that we take can be kind of defined by code or by packages sent around, which ultimately boils down to tokens. And it turns out that LLMs can actually do this, right? They're not trained on this necessarily from scratch, but they can actually do this general level intelligence on actions, which is really, really cool. So that's a cutting edge right now. And it's always good to know that this is the worst that they're ever going to be, right? They're going to get quickly very much better, and it's pretty wild, the progress that's happened so far. So I think for this interview, we actually also have a QR code that you can use to submit questions. I think you can scan. Actually, is that right? I was told there was going to be a QR code anyway. And you can scan that QR code, and you can submit questions, and you can also vote on the existing questions that are there. And I'll get them up on my iPad here. I have my own notes on my phone, so I'll be switching between my screens a little bit here. So you excuse that. But let's get into this. So we're going to be speaking about AI hacking, and specifically using these LLMs in an agentic way to kind of start doing the various tasks that we're interested in. One of those tasks is in the realm of cybersecurity. There's going to be people who want to use those capabilities in an offensive type way as a hacker, but there's also obviously most of us going to want to use them in a defensive type way of how to figure out how to stop hackers. So, and the best person I can think of to speak about this and speak about this with is obviously Kay from ICO. So, first, Kay, you're obviously anonymous, but maybe you can share a little bit about your backgrounds and how you came to found ICO.
Sure, absolutely. So I've been in cybersecurity now for almost a decade. So I basically worked both on the offensive and defensive side. So I worked from a security analyst who basically had to sit and watch logs and check if there is any abnormalities in the infrastructure and the network for 24 hours sometimes. And after that, I also worked basically in the offensive side, where I was a red team operator, and later I was as a red team engineering lead, where basically we just do what real hackers do, except basically we kind of get paid for it. So basically that's I think that's the background I have in general. So I worked on both sides, so I understand everything from the breaches that happened, and some very major breaches that we were involved in, and that were super fun to actually see what really happened on the inside look. And also more so on the offensive side, where basically we actually had to penetrate into very large systems and very secure systems and find new vulnerabilities that were not found before. So I started with AI in around the time where AlphaGo documentary went on, and I think basically that's the moment where I said, okay, yeah, this is gonna be the future. So that's basically where I got into deep learning and AI in general. And since then, I've been basically like tinkering with the idea of actually like automating the hacker intuition and actually making it like possible to do like completely in an agentic system.
Awesome. And you want to tell us a little bit about what ICO is, what it does, and yeah, I guess what the actual product kind of is and how it works?
Right. So currently we have basically two products. So our first product that we released is more so focused on web applications, where basically, so to give a little background on how you would do normally a penetration test is you would call a consulting company, you would basically schedule a call, you basically give a briefing about what your application or what your system does, and you have to basically schedule, I don't know, an appointment with a would or have an availability for their penetration testers, and basically they come in at that time. Sometimes it takes days, sometimes it takes weeks, and more often than not, basically it takes like over 2 or 3 weeks to even get like your report back, which may not work for a lot of companies because at the time a lot of things may have already changed in the application itself. So what we're doing is basically automating the whole process, so we make it like hassle free. So you kind of like just log in, or rather you sign up and log in, and you just add your website. We do an automatic verification check on the background. So basically just give you a token to add to your website so we can prove that it's yours, and basically add it to our backend system, and our AI basically starts doing what a normal hacker would do.
That's awesome. And can you maybe dig into a little bit of the details of like what is it that you're actually doing in terms of the AI side of things? Are you just calling OpenAI's APIs, or what else are you doing?
Right. So basically, we're working on our own models. So there are a lot of difficulties when it comes to actually working with, you could say, large provider models. So we're basically hosting our own, and we have to do our own fine tuning, and we have to also do basically a little magic under the hood, because currently, while LLMs are like super capable, they're still lacking in certain areas. So we have to actually like compensate for those specific areas in different ways. So currently, basically, the AI, you can consider it basically as a loop where basically it tries to generate new mutations and new inputs for the web application it's trying to penetration test, and then it basically classifies or puts like certain degrees of truth or possibilities for certain potential vulnerabilities that it had found, and basically continues on those until it had confirmed that there is actually of an exploitable vulnerability in that specific endpoint or area in the application.
Awesome. And I can also just speak, we obviously tested the product ourselves with a few portfolio companies during our investment process. And it's pretty cool to go from, yeah, maybe a 2 or 3 week process of scheduling calls with individual hackers to do a penetration test down to basically a few hours. And the quality of the report that you get at the end is like of similar quality. So it's pretty wild. So when you started kind of building ICO, what kind of parts of what you're doing at ICO are LLMs pretty good at, like straight out of the box? And what parts are they not so good at? So like, can an LLM like GPT-4 already do like decent hacking attempts? Or is there like more that's needed?
So the thing with LLMs is that they're still lacking like an internal word model. So the planning side on them is still a bit lacking. But when it comes to actually like generating maybe new inputs that may be related to like a previously seen potential vulnerability, they're like super good at that, because they can give you like a lot of actual new things to actually try, and you can basically just send those back, read the response, and the response is basically understood by the LLM itself. So you don't need to actually like do anything manually in that side. So LLMs are very capable when it comes to that. And obviously they're very capable in generating like a report with all the details that the customer needs to see in it and the other stuff.
But you reckon that it could someone just log on to ChatGPT and be like, hey, can you help me hack this website? This is the code for the front page.
Oh no, no. I'm sadly okay. Maybe fortunately, we're not at that stage yet, and I don't think we're gonna actually reach that stage anytime soon. But so you can't actually do that. You need to have certain, you could say, engineering blocks in place for that to already like even start the process of actually doing it. But so for example, if you go to ChatGPT and basically just say, okay, how do I hack this website? First of all, you're gonna get censored. So it gonna tells you like, I can't help you with this. But even if you get past it and say this is for a CTF, or I would need something very specific in this specific area, it's still gonna struggle a little bit to actually like give you all the details. So you need to actually like use the LLM as a part of the entire system and not just like rely on it entirely.
And kind of how does that change when you embed, let's say, GPT-4 in like an agentic type loop where you're like asking it repeatedly and you're asking it to kind of make a plan and all this kind of stuff, like, and you give it the tools that it needs to kind of start accessing APIs. Like, is it decent at that already, or like, has it been? I guess like, the training data that it has, I don't know how much of relevant data it's actually being trained on, right?
Right. So basically, it's pretty good when it comes to, how do I say this? So it's pretty decent when it comes to actually like making requests that have been previously seen in like past reports, or something that some exploits that have already been like published to GitHub or whatever, and it can actually like generate like close things that are, or rather close, you could say like mutations to that specific exploit, but it can't actually like plan the entire process from like 1 to 0 and actually like do everything on its own. So you can't just basically ask it, okay, can you basically like just generate complete new exploit like creatively and basically make this specific endpoint like usable for me.
Makes sense. And so I guess, like, what about on the defensive side? Like, if you're asking these LLMs out of the box to kind of help you provide robustness to your existing systems, like, to me that sounds like a much harder task because you need a lot more maybe context to understand how to kind of make them more robust. Like, are they decent at that already, or is that fundamentally a harder problem?
So it is my belief that it will actually be easier to integrate LLMs into the defensive side, but it's still a little bit hard to basically like just gather the entire, as you said, like the entire context and the entire environment. So the hardest thing when it comes to defensive security is actually not just fixing things, but more so making sure that you can fix things without breaking the existing environment. So that's basically like the biggest challenge. So LLMs basically are capable in fixing certain specific things. So let's say you have, I don't know, like an IPv6 vulnerability or something. I'm sorry, I'm trying not to go like super technical here, but if you
So
have
good.
something like that, you can basically just say, okay, I can change this, and the LLM will basically give you like the 5 or 6 steps that you need to actually do to actually fix it, and you can actually make that an agent. So that's going to be fine. But for it to actually take in consideration all the possible network topology, or all the possible like different complications of the infrastructure, to make sure that change will not break anything else connected to it, is the biggest challenge.
So, I mean, I think it's super interesting that you reckon that the defensive side is benefiting the most here, right? So we've already started getting like a proliferation of like pretty good models that are much smaller than the ones you access via APIs and that are often open source, right? Like, so we got Llama 3 that like is not quite at GPT-4 quality, but fairly close, and it's obviously already out there. The weights are out there, so you can start fine-tuning them yourself. And Meta is likely going to be releasing a 400 billion parameter model soon as well, also in the Llama 3 series. I think the biggest one that they released so far in the Llama 3 series is 70 billion. So in that, like, once you have these open source models, then I guess the censoring type of thing suddenly breaks pretty quickly, right? And then you can start fine-tuning them maybe on agentic type loops where you embed them in a system that's trying to hack something. Like, to me, that just sounds like the hackers just have a massive advantage there because, you know, they have necessarily no rules to abide by, and they can try any attack vector they want. So, like, why wouldn't that just be a massive advantage compared to the defensive side?
So I believe that basically, so when it comes to actual advantage, I believe that, so just to be clear, I believe that offensive side is going to actually like be more advantageous because we're going to basically have more capacity to like do more attacks. And basically, so the current system, or rather the current ecosystem in hacking, is basically we have very limited talent in penetration testing and offensive security. And when it comes to defensive side, basically they're mostly like reactionary, if that makes sense. So they're not basically finding like new attack vectors and trying to patch them like beforehand. It's more so, okay, there is this new attack vector that has shown itself like somewhere else, so we're gonna be ready for it as well. But with when it comes to actual hackers, or rather like unethical hackers, basically they have a lot of incentives and motives to basically just kind of do a lot of work for free. And after basically they hack or breach into a system, they can just encrypt everything, basically like make a lot of money. Whereas in offensive security, basically the companies are not as incentivized most of the time to actually like invest in cybersecurity, because everyone thinks like no one's going to care about me and my data is not that important. So in terms of advantage, of course, offensive security is going to do a lot more. But what I meant is more so that on the defensive side, it's a lot easier to integrate like the current tech into defensive side than the offensive side.
Interesting. That's super interesting. So you're kind of saying that like it's almost like a second order effect, that you have like sure there'll be a bunch of hacks that happen quickly when suddenly you can use LLMs for hacking, but as soon as one hack is kind of successful, then people can patch it everywhere else. And as soon as people wake up to the reality of these AI-driven hacks, they'll be able to actually muster the resources to actually use AI to kind of scale the limited talent that exists in offensive cybersecurity to kind of make security better overall. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
exactly. That's precisely what I'm saying. So I think that's a huge advantage, because for the first time in history, I believe that defenders will actually have a chance to actually like keep up with the offensive side, if that makes sense. Because as I said, like defensive side has always been reactionary, and it's always been the attackers being like one or two steps ahead, and now it's finally like gonna change a little bit.
That's super interesting. Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, because I mean, you're right. The talent in this space is like pretty sparse, and as you say, probably the most lucrative way to use those talents is actually to be hacking, right? To start off with. So if we can suddenly have a superhuman agent that is able to hack better than any human can, then that's actually a massive. Yeah, I guess the defensive players have a lot more resources also to spend on being defensive rather than attackers on being attackers. So speaking of that, then, so like let's say when do you think that the first like serious autonomous driven hack is going to occur, or do you think it's already happened?
So when it comes to autonomous, I believe like we can actually like disregard like the AI bit a little bit from it, because I think everyone has heard about Stuxnet at this point. So there are a lot of like worms like that basically shown itself over the years, where it can propagate over the network automatically and basically like just find certain targets that it's looking for and do a lot of work like completely automatically without being controlled by any attackers remotely. But when it comes to actual autonomous AI hacking, I think it hasn't happened yet, but I think it's gonna happen around, I don't know, I give it like a year max, where basically we'll see it like in the headlines.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I guess differentiating between like a worm that is a program that's kind of crawling the network automatically. But I guess the main difference is whether or not the code is kind of pre-written versus using a neural network in the loop at some point. Like, do you think like
Yeah.
the first autonomous hack? So let's say we specifically use like a definition of that. There's some kind of neural network involved in the loop. Do you think that they would be using like a full LLM, or would they be using like a small one that kind of transports along, or like what do you think that the stack would look like for that first autonomous hack?
So I think that it's gonna be just an LLM that's gonna, how do I say this? I am very convinced in the way or like our research is heading. So I might be slightly biased here, but I think that it's gonna be like an LLM just like doing very specific things from the hack itself. So I believe, so for planning something like that big, it's gonna need something other than LLM. So let's say like reinforcement learning or any other thing that basically like brings an internal word model that allows basically the neural network to actually like be able to like plan more than like 10 or 12 steps ahead, if that makes sense.
Interesting. I mean, like some of the biggest hacks in the past have been driven by kind of nation states, right? Accessing critical infrastructure or like yeah, for very strategic purposes. Do you reckon that there are nation states that are right now training LLMs in some kind of reinforcement learning environment to get better at hacking?
I believe so, yeah. So we've seen basically a lot of APTs, so the nation state hackers that you basically mentioned. So we've seen a lot of different things from them over the years, and the common point that that had always repeated itself is that they were always basically like ahead of the curve, obviously because they have funding and they have extreme like insane talent in their ranks. So I think this has already been happening for a while now. It's just that it hasn't really reached like the public yet.
Yeah, fascinating. Very scary. So, like, given where we're at right now and how kind of fast things have evolved, right? Like, I mean, you started ICO like relatively recently, like 6-ish months ago. So, like,
Yeah.
what do you think this space is going to look like in like 5 years? Like, what does cybersecurity services such as ICO look like? What do you offer? How good are they?
So that's a really good question. So I believe that it's gonna be super tough to actually like have the old players, and this is my own thinking, that to actually like keep up with the new players, especially the ones that have basically like started everything from scratch and actually like took this direction from the start. So the technology is gonna be there, but I think to actually like reach like the soda level or the state of the art, it's gonna be quite hard unless you basically have like a very dedicated team with like insane research talent. So basically, how OpenAI happened or how Anthropic happened, basically it was just like very cracked people doing a lot of research all day long, and then they finally found like their secret recipe that they can actually scale, and then they can continue on. So I think the talent is the most important thing here, and I feel that it's basically taken either by very large companies that are usually working like Meta or like I said, like OpenAI or whatever, or the new startups that are basically like working on some very cool stuff, like not just LLMs.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, also, I should probably have asked you up front, but how many people are you in ICO at the moment?
Right. So we are currently 4 people. So basically, we're all from a research background, and basically, we're just like just doing a lot of interesting and a lot of very creative work like all day long. And I feel like we're very much ahead of like most of what's out there at the moment, and we plan on releasing some very cool stuff like very soon. Like especially when it comes to the papers that we're gonna actually put out.
Super cool. So, I mean, given this dynamic that you were talking about earlier around this kind of second order effects that's going to be favoring defense in the cybersecurity space, like, do you think that people on average are going to be, or like companies are going to be spending more or less money on making sure that they're safe, like from cyber attacks, compared to how much they spend today?
So I believe that actually the cost is going to decrease significantly because that's the point basically of using AI in the entire ecosystem, is that we actually remove the barrier of entry for a lot of companies that struggled in the past to actually like do more than 2 or 3 pen tests a year, and we actually make it possible for them to actually do it like on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis without like costing them a fortune. So the cost is definitely going to increase, and the quality is the cost is going to decrease, and the quality is going to increase by like exponentially.
But what about if you have lots of attackers that are constantly kind of scouring your network, and the attacker load is so much heavier, and so you need to be much more certain that you're safe? Like, doesn't that kind of have like an upwards force on the amount that you were willing to spend to protect yourself?
I suppose so. Yeah, I guess that can happen. It's just okay. So I personally think that most companies are going to be able to actually like spend a lot less, because once you fix like a certain like vector path, basically you have already like reduced like a huge amount of like possibilities that can happen, because all basically attacks are kind of like chained with each other. So if kind of like close one, you've already maybe closed like 3 or 4 others without you actually knowing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think it's super interesting. Like, we've been thinking a lot about this because we've done quite a few investments in the kind of agent space. And whenever you're investing in an AI agent type product, you're almost always basically replacing some proportion of a person at some point, right? And if it gets better, then you'll be replacing more people, right? And in the past, when we've done that, obviously the costs have gone down, but the kind of willingness to spend may actually increase because you're also getting more value for your money at the end of the day. So one example is like QA testing, which is also related to cybersecurity, in the sense that like if you have to pay a human person to do QA testing for you in every deploy, then you're only going to do it when it's really important, right? But if you can have an AI that's doing it and it costs cents, then maybe you'll do it for like every single commit to your repo, like end-to-end testing, or like using like an AI agent clicking around your web app. And actually, maybe the kind of cumulative money you end up spending is more because you kind of are able to do it at like a lower threshold of kind of increment, if that makes sense. So I think it's super interesting, but I like your answer. Yeah.
Perfect.
And but related to that, then, do you think that the like at the moment there's obviously I tried to Google this, but there's a huge amount of variance in like the amount of losses from cybersecurity breaches every year, and it's ranging everywhere from like the billions to like even the hundreds of billions, depending on what sources you use. Do you think those kind of losses from like serious hacks are going to increase or decrease or stay the same?
So my take on that is basically it's gonna be a decrease in like the global maximum and a more increase in the local maximum, if that makes sense. So since a lot of more companies are going to be able to actually afford like super high quality penetration testing and hacking, ethical hacking, it's going to make a lot of companies a lot safer. And basically that's going to block a lot of potential breaches that basically like real hackers are targeting. And but for the ones that were unlucky, or the ones that basically just, I don't know, they weren't on the right side of things, I think that's gonna cost them a lot, because the hackers have to basically compensate for the lack of like potential targets that they can actually go for.
Interesting. Yeah. That's cool. I like that you're so optimistic. I personally am a little bit more pessimistic when it comes to this, but I think it's you're definitely the one that has more knowledge. So I trust you.
No, all good, all good. It's just subjective, yeah.
Yeah. Just a reminder to the audience that you can submit questions also to the QR code, which I think was there before. I'm not sure if we can put it back up. I've got one question here from the audience, which I thought was interesting. So the question is, how likely is it for an AI agent to kind of go rogue and accidentally break things while it's doing a penetration test, compared to kind of stopping at the right moment, using the judgment that maybe a human would have? Is that like a risk?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that's one of the areas where our research is actually like super important, because that's very possible, and we try our best to like never let that happen, especially like in production environments for our clients. But yeah, that currently that's still like a risk. But I think with the right stopgaps or with the right breaks, it's still kind of manageable so far. But once we go into the territory of like super complex applications or very large enterprises, that's going to be like slightly harder, and we need to actually put a lot more focus on that specifically.
Yeah, super interesting. I guess, like, how do you even begin to? Because I mean, I guess eventually you can start training on this kind of data and like get better kind of common sense of what to do. But like, yeah, how long until we can start getting that better common sense in that specific domain? Or do you think that the new models that is automatically going to have better common sense also in this domain?
So my take here might be surprising to a lot of people, but I do believe that LLMs are gonna stagnate for a little bit in a while for a while. So even with the 400 billion model that's gonna be released, for example, from Meta, it's gonna be a very long way to achieve like super high reasoning or super high basically super high stats compared to what we have currently. And I believe to actually escape from this basic kind of pit, we need to actually like focus on more other stuff like reinforcement learning or meta reinforcement learning, or basically other methods like self-play when it comes to models, or basically betting on something else that isn't basically just scaling the current what we currently have.
Super interesting. Like, why do you believe that? What's the cause?
So I've seen basically, so because I've worked with models for a very long time, like very heavily, I've seen like, I think I have seen the limitations more closely than a lot of other people who had basically just, had quick interactions with the models themselves. So I could pretty much see, or I guess agree with Yan LeCun from Meta, but I think everyone knows him, that I think LLMs are not the real way to actually achieving like near AGI or like any super high reasoning system. So that's basically my bet as well.
Super interesting. Are you also then exploring using your own fine-tuned open source models in kind of reinforcement learning environments to get better?
So I don't want to go too much into the details of that, but,
Yeah,
but
fair.
basically, yeah, we are basically using like open source models for our with our own fine tunes for basically our specific purposes on tasks on that area.
Fair. Makes sense. It's a super interesting area, and I think having an edge in this field right now is probably going to lead to like more of an edge kind of long term, right? I think these things tend to compound, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I mean, what would you kind of recommend for companies to be doing right now to make sure that they're kind of prepared for this future? So if they haven't started dabbling in the kind of AI-driven pen testing field or AI-driven cybersecurity, like what's the first step? Like how do people start getting protected?
So first of all, you can just contact us on our website. I think that's like the best thing you can do. But really, I think it's just being kind of like just kind of playing maybe with models a little bit and just kind of getting an idea of like what's actually happening in the field and just kind of like seeing the current capabilities of what we have is a very good idea to basically like put you on the right path to see if like this is a good bit for you at the moment or maybe it actually needs a little bit more time for you to actually integrate it.
So would you say that pen testing is like a good place to start if you're going to kind of start using AI in some type of cybersecurity application? Or are there other places as well that people should look?
So like from an enterprise perspective or
Yeah, well, I guess most of the people here that are founders, I think probably are founders of relatively early stage startups. So I guess like things that are relevant in their context.
yeah, for sure. So I believe that it's worth the attempt because at the moment, so for example, with ICO, we actually offer it for like a very cheap pricing. So it's like 1/10 the price of what you would normally get from like a quote from a consulting company doing cybersecurity. So you can basically just give it a try and you can see like the quality of the reports yourself and see all the vulnerabilities or bugs that like the great developers you have may have missed, and maybe they will actually ask you to actually like do it more often themselves because it actually like helps them find more things instead of actually going through like the hassle of finally shipping and finally finding something that is broken that has to be rebuilt from scratch.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, and given that, like, I think that the reports that I saw coming out of ICO were already like a bunch of months ago, like close to human level in certain areas. Like, how soon would you say that you would be able to be superhuman, at least in some areas?
Oh, that's a hard question. Okay, let's see. I think I do give it around, and this is me being optimistic, but I do give it around like 16 months or so, or 18 months or so. I think that's basically we're going to be able to actually achieve that kind of level. And as for this is for web, right?
Mm.
But for other stuff, like for example, for 0 days in very large complex systems like Windows or Linux kernel or like a very known VPN software, I think that's going to take a little bit more time because the research in that area is still a lot more complex, if that makes sense.
Cool. And then before I end, maybe the last thing was a bit of a conspiracy question. So there was obviously big exploit that came out around a popular tool called XZUtils. And my question is, what do you think the odds are that that exploit was AI generated in some capacity?
Zero. I think that's my honest take. I think it's a zero chance because we're actually taking a look at it and we've actually found basically you could say like certain TTPs that were used in the past, and we also know that current models are not really that good at this point.
How soon do you think that models would be good enough to generate that kind of thing?
I give it around around 2 years. I think around 2 years we'll be able to actually see that kind of progress, which is why I also urge like everyone basically I know to actually like start actually making sure that what they have is good, because once it's out there, like the hackers are not going to wait until you actually fix things. Like once it's out there, they're basically going to use it for their advantage, and if you're not on the right side already or if you're not prepared, then it's going to be a little bit tough.
Cool. Thank you so much for your time, Kay, and really appreciate your time here in the audience as well. That was a super interesting conversation. So thanks a lot.
Th- Thank you as well. Thank you for the questions.